Hi, everyone. I think we can begin to start. I'm very happy to welcome you at this workshop. This is actually the second of the meetings on LFG that we are now organizing in Moscow. The first was in April, and this time we are under the umbrella of the Eurasian Congress of Linguists. And it is very warming for my heart to see the interest for LFG expanding, especially among my peers, the younger generation of researchers, and also to see more works in LFG to appear in Russia. And I think that this time is also special because our first speaker today will be Asudeh. He is one of the, I think, most prominent, fair to say, figures in the LFG community. He has been one of the co-authors of the, I think it's called a handbook or a reference guide, officially, the 2016 reference guide to LFG.
No, it's called lexical functional syntax. You're thinking of Mary's book.
Oh, lexical functional, the textbook by John.
Yeah. So it's a textbook on LFG, one of the most widely used reference guides to LFG, and he has also been a prominent use of glue semantics, for which one could see, for example, the book on pronominal resumption, which Ash authored in the early 2010s, and he also authored a chapter in the new LFG handbook on it. And the other chapter he co-authored in the LFG handbook, the new LFG handbook, is dedicated to morphology. And so morphology is, I think, the area to which most of Ash's work is dedicated today. And I hope that the promise of lexical realization of functional grammar, about which Ash will speak about today, will inspire at least some members of the audience. So I think we can welcome Ash and begin our workshop.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a real honor to be able to present to this body again. So the title of the talk is Distributed Morphology Without Movement, Fusional Morphology Without Paradigms. So the outline is basic and simple. I'm going to briefly introduce this theory called lexical realizational functional grammar, which Dan Siddiqui and I originated, but which has a growing group of people, including Oleg Belyaev and Danil Alexeyev, who are part of our lab and are contributing. And so a lot of this is really coming out of our weekly lab, and I don't want to take sort of prime ownership of it. That wouldn't be fair. Okay, so what is LRFG as we call it? It's a form of distributed morphology built around a lexical functional grammar syntax. Okay, so the theory has no movement, neither phrasal nor head, in line with LFG, and it has no zeromorphs and no paradigms. So some of the things that these obviously mechanisms or concepts are used to model, we have to model in different ways, but we think we can effectively capture what people have tried to capture using these notions with other mechanisms. So I'm going to show its application to complex phenomena in English, Ojibwe, Latin, and English. Hopefully we get to all of that. But let me first introduce the theory. So LRFG is a fully constraint-based or declarative theory that marries distributed morphology as a theory of morphology to lexical functional grammar as a theory of syntax and grammatical architecture. So our grammatical architecture is not identical to LFG's because, well, I won't get into the reasons, but it's very much inspired by it. So LRFG uses the formal tools of LFG to model a constraint-based version of DM. LRFG is thus constraints all the way down, to borrow a phrase from our recent Wickful paper. Well, actually, it's from Wickful 21, but it still hasn't come out. So well, actually, I think it might be out just now, but there was some delays having to do with the pandemic and so on. So nevertheless, LRFG is a daughter theory, i.e. version of both DM and LFG. Following DM, it's a morphemic theory, lexical in the Stump 2001 classification. So unfortunately, the name of the theory is a pun that we thought was funny, and then it kind of stuck. So obviously, by lexical, we don't mean lexical in the sense of lexical functional grammar. We mean lexical in this morphemic sense from Stump. And obviously, realizational is the other axis that Stump uses. And that is obviously something it inherits from DM as a realizational theory. Okay. So ironically, despite Stump calling it a lexicalist theory, what characterizes theories like DM is that it has no lexical processes, but only a list of exponents mappings, which are called vocabulary items in the literature. Okay. So it's not that it doesn't have some repository of elements. It has a lexicon in that sense, which is called a vocabulary, but it doesn't have a lexicon that quote unquote does things, unlike in, say, HPSG or standard LFG. Following LFG, LRFG has no zeromorphs. The mechanism of spanning obviates these. And as a non-derivational theory, there's no head or even phrasal movement. You can look at our paper from last year's LFG conference for our alternative to head movement. From DM, LRFG inherits strengths in dealing with polysynthesis, which seems like an unlikely candidate for a paradigmatic treatment. From LFG, LRFG inherits strengths in dealing with non-configurationality. So we've by now written quite a few papers in this framework, so I refer you to those for further details. I think they're all listed here, or at least mostly listed here. And I draw your attention to our website, which is on the handout here, where you can find most of these, as well as lab membership and so on. Okay, so now let's talk about, or let's just look at the architecture and talk about it a little bit of LRFG. So the flow of information in this architecture starts with constituent structure, because in DM we want to be realizing pieces of syntax. And then there's two paths for the architecture. The upper path we call the morphology, prosody, phonology path. So first we have this mapping from constituent structure to vocabulary structure. This is our innovation. And this mapping looks like a little V. I will call it a V mapping, but it's actually a Greek ν, obviously. And then from vocabulary structure, the rho mapping takes us to prosodic structure. The O mapping takes prosodic structure to phonological form, and that's the final form that's delivered. The other path is the meaning path, structure, function, meaning. So on this path, we have the normal LFG-like phi projection to functional structure, then the normal LFG-like sigma projection from functional structure to semantic structure, and following Dalrymple and Nikolaeva's book on information structure and differential object marking, we have the iota mapping from semantic structure to information structure, and at the end of that path, we deliver the meaning. Okay? Now, you shouldn't view these arrows as really directional in the sense of processes. So if we're trying to parse a sentence in LRFG, we try to assign it a constituent structure per the phrase structure rules of the language. And then we see what form and meaning that kind of constituent structure delivers. If we are doing language comprehension, so we get a meaning, what we're doing is saying, okay, here's my target meaning. What are the structures that would get me there? And what are the possible forms that that meaning has, for example? So I can talk about that in more detail later in question time if anything was confusing, but I think it's nicer to get into details rather than leaving it at this very abstract level. So exponents in this theory is handled at V structure, which stands for vocabulary structure, as we just saw in the architecture. So from our forthcoming book, to which Oleg is also a contributor, here's the definition of exponent. Exponents are interface objects that link a set of morphosyntactic properties called exponenda to a phonological representation called a realization. So from our paper with Tina Bogle last year, if you look in 2, LRFG has a more precise notion of exponents and realization than standard DM does, in my opinion, because DM standardly conflates these two things. Okay, but an exponent is if an exponent is an interface object, then it doesn't have any form. It still needs to get mapped to realization, right? So this is a more sort of mentally hygienic way of doing it. So we have some exponenda. We V-map them to an exponent, and then this is the composition of the O and rho mappings from above, which gives us our realization. So the resulting V structures have this kind of shape. I'm not saying all V structures have all this information, but this is the kind of information they can have. So first, we have a number of features having to do with form, in particular, the phonological representation. So like something like the underlying representation, the prosodic frame, and the prosodic domain. So basically, the phonological representation captures phonological realization and conditions, as in this is what it delivers to the actual phonology to sort out. Prosodic frame is a prosodic unit that shows what kind of prosodic context this form demands. And prosodic domain is showing something similar, but not exactly the same. It's showing basically the domain in which it gets prosodified, if you want to put it that way. The dependence feature basically tells you if the thing is a left leaner or a right leaner. Okay, so this could be a clitic or it could be an affix. It's just showing its direction of attachment. The class feature captures inflectional classes. We'll see an example of that when we look at Latin. And the host feature is responsible for, in the case of, it's the host ident feature actually, which is responsible for attaching affixes to their hosts. So this, I won't do much more than tantalize you here. This is our equivalent of head movement. But there's no movement, okay? So if you would like more details on that, please see Asudeh et al. 2023. So now let's talk about vocabulary items and the vocabulary. So the vocabulary in LRFG is a list of vocabulary items, as in standard distributed morphology. However, LRFG is somewhat more explicit about how the contents of the vocabulary are represented. In order to be selected for exponents, a vocabulary item must be compatible with the information in the syntax that it expones. So in other words, categories and features are what we are expressing from the syntax. In order to be compatible, the exponenda and the vocabulary item must match the category or categories of the syntactic elements. The reason I say possibly categories is because we have spanning. So sometimes the list sometimes there's more than one category that the thing expresses. So in order to be compatible, the exponenda and the vocabulary item must match the category or categories of the syntactic elements that it is expressing, and it must contain a subset of the features that the syntax delivers for exponents. Okay, so a vocabulary item can't be more expressive than what it's trying to express, but it can be less expressive. That's how you get emergence of the unmarked kind of effects in these kinds of frameworks. So let us call the syntactic exponenda C exponenda because they're represented at C structure, and let's call the exponenda in the vocabulary V exponenda. Thus, prospective V exponenda must match the C exponenda per the criteria above, and V exponenda are mapped to a V structure by the V really new correspondence function. So the general case we get is like this. So this is a vocabulary item. Its left-hand side is a pair. The first member of the pair is something that encodes distribution, a list of categories. And the second member of the pair is this thing, which I'll say more about shortly. But this is an encoding of the function and meaning. And all of that, these exponenda are then mapped to a V structure. Now, the contents of the V structure will be the kind that we saw in 3. So the first coordinate of the pair on the left-hand side is a list of constituent structure syntactic categories representing the distribution of the exponendum. So it's a list in order to support spanning. The second coordinate is the union of 3 sets, a set F of equations and constraints about the F structure, a set G of glue meaning constructors, and a set I of equations and constraints on information structure. Notice that any or all of these sets could be empty. And for example, when we think about something like declension classes, they're not contributing any information in their second coordinate. So this union, F union G union I, can be pronounced fugui, given the resemblance of the union symbol to U, and we will henceforth refer to this component as a fugui. So now let's talk a little bit about blocking and competition. Like DM, LRFG is an elsewhere or Paninian theory of morphology, so it features blocking and emergence of the unmarked. However, unlike much work in DM, LRFG eschews the use of optimality theory for computing its competitions. Instead, we assume 4 blocking principles. I'll only display the, that's just an extraneous word, the intuitions behind these, but they're formalized in the body of LRFG work listed above. So the most informative family of principles concern information in the left-hand side of vocabulary items, i.e. information in V exponenda. What kind of information do we have in these? Well, we have, there should be a C here. We have information about constituent structure, or categories at least. We have information about feature structures. We have semantic information in the shape of glue meaning constructors. Technically, we also have information about information structure, but that's the part of the theory that we've least explored. So most informative C says prefer portmanteau forms whenever possible on C structural grounds. So choose the VI that realizes the greater list of categories. So this is defined on lists. If list A contains list B, list A is more informative. Most informative F says prefer portmanteau forms whenever possible on F structural grounds. Choose the VI that defines an F structure that contains the greater set of features defined on feature structures. So if feature structure A contains the information in feature structure B, feature structure A is more informative. And lastly, most informative S, which has to do with semantics. So prefer portmanteau forms whenever possible on semantic grounds. Choose the VI whose denotation is more semantically contentful. So here we've got it defined as structural proof entailment. So if the proof for meaning A entails the proof for meaning B, meaning A is more informative. The remaining principle, most specific, concerns the right-hand side of vocabulary items, i.e. information in the exponent V structure. So most specific basically says prefer affixes whenever possible. So defined on feature structures, same as in 6 above. And that's it for those. So now we're going to get into the the language data. So I've picked these things as sort of ways to highlight work we've done in recent years, but also because each language sort of tells us something about something. Okay, so the case for English is one that Dan and I have worked on recently, and it's a nice way to look at the issue of feature containment. So the English comparative is obviously has had a lot of stuff written about it in the last 25 years or so. But what we're interested here are so-called ABB patterns, like good, better, best. So following Bobolik, a standard approach to the distribution of comparatives and superlatives is some type of feature containment. So there's a typological claim and a theoretical claim here. The typological claim that Bobolik's idea gives us is if the comparative is suppletive for a given root, the superlative is never regular. So in other words, we don't get the pattern ABA. That would be something like good, better, goodest. Okay. So you'll either regularize the whole thing or the positive form, or like the standard form, the non-comparative, non-superlative, will be one form A, and the other two will be the suppletive form. The theoretical claim here is that this pattern arises precisely because superlatives also express the featural content of comparatives, in addition to the feature that marks superlative. So we assume the following fairly simple structure for comparatives and superlatives in English. I don't know if this is super clear, but notice that this V mapping here is dotted. Talk about that in a second. So we've assumed here, following Huddleston and Pullum's large grammar of English, that this thing is something called a grade phrase. It doesn't really matter what the thing is. What matters to us is that more and to take the comparative case, are alternative exponents of that same G category. So note that the dotted mapping that I just tried to highlight represents Pac-Man spanning. So if a node would be unexponed due to a lack in the vocabulary, it's mapped to the exponent of another node in the same projection, rather than to a null exponent. So this is how we avoid zeros. This also gives me the opportunity to introduce some detailed vocabulary items for the English comparative. So we don't have to go through all the details, but let's just look at a few. One of the things I want to highlight is notice that these vocabulary items have semantics. So they come with semantic information. Now, this is a glue meaning constructor, so there'll also be information about the syntax semantics interface paired with this meaning, but we've simplified things by just showing the meaning language side. So this is doing some kind of, this is a comparative function, obviously. This is distinct from this. This is the comparative macro, which I'll explain in a second, and it introduces the comparative feature to the F structure. So this is the affixal comparative. So it's realized as it has a certain prosodic frame that it requires and a certain prosodic domain. So it has to be prosodified within the prosodic word, and it has to be part of a bisyllabic foot and so on. So some speakers allow this to be trisyllabic. But there's variation at this point. Okay. The superlative introduces a different function. This is est, and it introduces the superlative macro. So notice that and est are much more morphophonologically restricted. They have many more features of saying like what their demands are with respect to phonology and prosody than do the free forms. So free forms in general have fewer features. They're less restricted. So this is more, and this is most. Again, they have the same compar and super things. They have the comparative in the case of more, function, superlative in the case of most, and they also contribute a grade thing. You can ask me about that in question time if you want, but this basically captures an interesting fact about and more that I think hasn't been highlighted enough in the literature, which is that more seems to have the capacity to get with ungradable things in a way that can't. So in other words, this grade function is a way for more and most to get a normal property of individuals into a degree property. that they can then modify using the comparative and superlative obligatory things. Of course, this grade thing is optional, as indicated by the parentheses, because if something is already gradable, like say intelligent and more intelligent, then you don't need this grade predicate. And in fact, including it would result in proof failure. Okay, so the most important thing here is that VIs come with semantics. Thus, LRFG takes compositional semantics seriously and treats it as a condition on exponents, thus opening up the possibility of a true theory of morphosemantics that is not parasitic on syntax. However, in current work, we treat the semantics as associated with VIs only and do not represent semantics as part of C exponenda, i.e. targets for matching with VIs. So this is a revision of what we did in a previous paper. So in other words, matching is a purely syntactic phenomenon. So let's return to containment now. So it is the macros compar and super that handle this. So what is a macro? It's just a named bundle of information. So when a macro is invoked by an @ call, the information named by the macro is simply substituted in place of the call. So we define these as follows. So comparative is very simple. Let's look at B first. It just says, I add the feature ups comparative equals plus. Now superlative literally contains comparative, right? But it also adds up superlative equals plus. So by calling comparative here, superlative effectively says up superlative equals plus and ups comparative equals plus. So this results in F structures like the following: comparative superlative, both plus for the superlative, just comparative plus for the comparative. Thus, the superlative contains the comparative as desired. Okay, and now for something completely different, let's go to the Algonquian language, Ojibwe, often called Anishinaabe. So Ojibwe has a complex voice system and is a polysynthetic language. So pre-theoretically, the sentence in 13 is a single word, right? And it means they saw us inclusive. So let's look at how the parts contribute to that. So obviously we have the past here. We've got the root. This is a transitivizing affix. This is inverse voice. I'll return to that in a second. And then we have this thing indicating second person, this thing indicating first person plural, and this thing indicating third person plural. So third person plural is the they, obviously. This 2 and 1 together give us inclusive first person plural. So us and you. And the inverse voice is what gives us the mapping, right? So normally there are restrictions on, there's a person hierarchy in Ojibwe that says, you know, that would normally in direct voice prefer the us to be the, yeah, it would be like we saw them, but the inverse voice flips that around. So you can think of it, I wouldn't go too far in this direction, but if it helps, it's a bit like a passive. Okay. So we have this complex tree. We have C exponenda in the leaves of the tree. So this is a bundle, the person feature with the add inclusive thing, T with tense. This thing here basically says if tense is unmarked, it's present. A lot of what Ojibwe is doing is bundled in its complex agreement system. So the agreement node has complex exponenda to match with. And the F structure we get for this whole thing is reasonably familiar, except that we have exploded the person feature to capture the person hierarchy in Ojibwe, which I'll come to in a second. Okay, so I'll leave this up for a few more seconds, but I don't expect you to sort of be able to just assimilate this. But notice that each terminal node is mapped to a node. So here we don't have any spanning. Each terminal node gets its own expression. So how do we handle this hierarchy, this person hierarchy? Well, we handle hierarchies in general in terms of something that, starting with our Latin paper, we started calling macro cascades. So let's go through how this cascade works briefly. Again, it uses the same macros that we saw with comparative and superlative. So the inclusive thing says you give it an argument and it says the argument's person speaker feature has plus. The argument's person hearer is also plus. So this is first person inclusive. But it also calls the @participant. It also calls the participant macro. Okay. So the participant macro says, I'm going to add the feature participant plus. So this is 1 and or 2 second person. So first or second person, and then it calls the proximate macro. The proximate macro adds the feature prox plus. So this is for persons third and above. Ojibwe has a slightly extended person system, but it also calls the animate macro. The animate macro adds anim plus. So this is another kind of third person and above. And the minimal information you can have is just that you're an entity. Okay. And I skipped the speaker and hearer macros, but these are for first person and second person inclusive packages these together. Okay. So it would in fact be harmless for these things to be @speaker and @hearer, because the @participant macro, if it's called redundantly, that's fine. The macros have information that can unify in the F structure anyway. I've also put on the handout some of the other macros that are used in that tree that you saw, but I don't want to talk about them. So basically, this macro cascade captures the hierarchy . Something like this. Okay, the Ojibwe paper has a lot more detail in it, so I refer you there. It's got a slightly older version of the theory notation-wise, but I don't think it should be too confusing. So we're really interested in the direct and inverse voice, which we are continuing to work on with Will Oxford, who's a specialist in the language. Okay, now let's talk about Latin. So why talk about Latin, right? It's not just because we're trying to, be like, oh, we're morphologists, we must talk about Latin. But the reason we're talking about Latin is because it has declension and conjugation, although we only looked at the declension system. Now, these are normally the purview of word-based theories. So declension and conjugation are handled with ease in word-based realizational theories, such as paradigm function morphology, but they're more challenging for morphemic theories that realize syntactic features, such as DM, because these are purely morphological phenomena. There are no relevant non-junk syntactic features to express. So Latin declension is also particularly challenging because it displays both metasyncretism and secondary exponents, as shown in table 4. So the rounded boxes, I can show a rounded box, are metasyncretism, and the square boxes are secondary exponents. So for example, in these cells of the quote-unquote paradigm. This is not a first-class object in our theory. It's just a way to organize data. This is an instance of metasyncretism. It's also an instance of secondary exponents. This is an instance of metasyncretism. It's also secondary exponents. Same with these two. These instances are just secondary exponents. So what are metasyncretism and secondary exponents? So metasyncretism is the phenomenon whereby the same syncretism patterns arise in different paradigms. So we have the dative ablative EE syncretism in class 2, but even though different forms are involved in class 3, the same cells are syncretic. Okay? So we have Ibu in class 3. Secondary exponents is the phenomenon whereby the same syncretism patterns arise in different paradigms. So again, we have instances of those in the two cases we saw, but also in the nominative and accusative plural in class 3, or the accusative plural in class 2. So note the mention of paradigms in the definition above, right? So both metasyncretism and secondary exponents refer to paradigms. Now, LRFG doesn't have paradigms, so the question is, can it do Latin? Yes, it can. A full fragment of Latin declension is presented in our forthcoming paper from this year's LFG conference. Let me just give you a little bit more information about how that would go. The first thing to note is that we model Latin as having a case hierarchy in the same way that we model the Ojibwe person hierarchy, so with macro cascades. So what this case hierarchy basically boils down to is nobody cares about vocative, but we can do it, so we have it there. Accusative, and then gen inherits from accusative, dative inherits from accusative, but not gen, and ablative inherits from dative. So here is just one VI from the fragment, which is sufficient to address metasyncretism and secondary exponents. So in terms of the category, this is a case marker, so we've assigned it the category K. It says, I'm calling the dative macro. Well, if you do that, then you add dative plus, but you also call accusative. So when you call accusative, you add accusative plus, but you also call nominative. So you get, oh, sorry, this should be also have a plus. You get nominative plus. So basically the dative is represented like this. Again, with containment. Okay. Now, let me also comment on what's going on here. So these double angled brackets are just a sort of notation we introduced to highlight this thing. This is morphological conditioning. This is saying this thing is exponed, or sorry, this thing's exponendum is exponed only in the context of plural. Okay. So we either realize this is E or Ibu. This is the same case from the table we just saw. E if the class is 1 or 2. Ibu if it's 3, 4, or 5. Now, how do we handle metasyncretism? The right-hand side of the VI is disjunctive, so giving one form in first and second declension and another form in the other declensions. How do we handle secondary exponents? The VI is conditioned by the feature plural, so it will appear in plural environments, but it doesn't expone plural or express plural. So this VI will appear in both dative and ablative because dative is a subset of ablative. The latter has one more feature, and there's no completing ablative suffix in the fragment. The only VI specified with ablative is restricted from plural environments. So this is an instance of let's call it emergence of the less marked. By the way, when I talk about markedness, I'm talking about morphological marking. I personally don't understand other senses of markedness. Lastly, let me come to English, which is the lab's latest work. So the lab's most recent unpublished work is on English, in particular the distribution and function of the additive clitic ta, which has been discussed by Peterson and Nichols in various venues, including in Nichols' excellent grammar of English, which we rely on quite a lot. We don't have access to speakers. So it appears in a number of environments, such as certain focus constructions and also in clause chaining, where a subordinate clause is dependent for at least one of its arguments, and possibly other features, on the clause that the dependent clause modifies. So here's a bunch of data from English. So notice the first case here is a case of focus. This is going by Peterson's classification, basically. So he calls this focus, he calls this emphatic coordination, he calls this a concessive clause. We treat all of these as instances of focus. Lastly, we have clause chaining. So notice here we have the cow stopped giving milk and died. One of the weird things about English, or challenging, I should say, no language is weird, is that we get this copying to support the clitic in some circumstances, but not in all circumstances. So here, the clitic is just hanging out on one of the preverbal particles. Okay. Why is it clause chaining? Because it's the same cow that stopped giving milk and died. Okay, so this is actually the chain clause. The main clause is just the cow died. Same in 19. The main clause is Musa left, and the chain clause is telling you that he left after putting the banana in the bag. Okay, so there's bag, there's banana, and then there's preverbal particles involved in this pudding. Okay. So now I'm going to have to go to hand-drawn slides, unfortunately, because I didn't have time to LaTeX all this. It's quite time-consuming to do these trees. So you'll have to forgive me for this, but here we go. So here's the first Peterson example, the focus example. How would we deal with this? Well, here we're saying that da is actually the head of a focus phrase, realizing the category focus and the feature additive plus. Okay. This focus phrase is in spec CP, which is a pretty normal focus phrase place to be. And then we haven't really gotten into the pronominal arguments very much, but we're just assuming that they're attached high at an S node and that this is a non-configurational layer so that these things can probably flip around, at least to some degree. We get a sensible F structure. Okay, I haven't told you about the vocabulary items yet, though. So we're building up to that, but let's look at all the syntactic cases first. So that's just simple focus. And now I'll tell you some news. Okay, or news is what I'll tell you now, or however you want to translate this. Here's emphatic coordination. Now, one of the things we need to understand here is that Peterson's example is a bit confusing here. So he translates it as neither the dog nor the cat ate the meat. But if you look at what's going on structurally, it's not the case that, negation, the dog or cat ate the meat. Okay. So again, we treat this as a coordination of two focus phrases. We don't know what this Euclidic thing is, but we just give it the category disj for disjunction. And importantly, ka is playing this focus role in both of the disjuncts. So we treat this in a standard LFG way. So we have this thing that's called a hybrid object. It says the coordination is or, and then the elements of the coordination are this dog ergative additive plus thing, this cat ergative additive plus thing. Note that topic and focus are represented at information structure, not directly in LFG syntax anymore. Okay, so here's the concessive, which was the third focus case. So notice that this is saying, even when Aisha cried, Musa didn't go. So the main clause is Musa didn't go, and this is the concessive clause. So again, we treat this as a focus particle. Okay. So yeah, we can just ignore those notes for now, at least. So that's the syntax for that case. And now let's look at a case called negative focus, which wasn't one of Peterson's cases that he looked at, I don't think. But it's from the English grammar that Johanna Nichols wrote. So notice here that we were talking about negation. So we have various kinds of negation in English. I'm not going to try to pronounce English because I have no idea how it's pronounced, but we have this guy, and this guy. Okay. But what this shows us is that the negation in these cases is competing for the same focus position with qa. So we take this to be evidence that qa and neg are in complementary distribution. At least qa and these forms of negation. Okay, and so the feature that we're getting is negative plus, not additive plus, because it's negation. Here we do have copying, though, and I want to draw your attention to an interesting fact about the copying, not in this example. So here we just have duocha, duocha. So this is this sentence, don't despair, or don't break, literally, I guess. But notice that there can be a suppletive relationship between the copy and the non-copy. So here's a suppletive version of the verb die, lej, and then here's the regular version. So we don't get lej negation lej, we get vala negation lej.
Ash,
Yes.
do you want to continue taking the time from questions? Currently, we have...
No, I'm just going to wind up. This is almost done.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the warning, though. Okay, so now this is clause chaining. Here we see a different negation sort of in the mix with qa. So how do we represent this? We treat this as a clitic cluster with the additive clitic a and the negative clitic sa. And they can come in either order, which is what this comma indicates. So the chain clause basically has the subject shared with this adjunct clause. Because it has a shared subject, it's called an exadj, not a regular adjunct. So we get this sharing, and hopefully the rest of the features make sense because I have to press on. These macros also give us a handle on possible typological, or let's say cross-linguistic variation. Typological is probably too strong a word. And here I refer you to Dalrymple. Sorry, I forgot myself. Asudeh, Dalrymple, and Toivonen, 2013 from JLM. So the idea is that the chain macro, which is called here, basically just says, oh, this thing's an exadj. But then you also have to say what the shared argument is. So we have this implicative relationship. If you share an object, you share an object only if you share a subject. In the case of English, we also share tense. So that's another possibility in chaining. Again, in the case of English, we also share mood. So that's another possibility in chaining. So chain English inherits from all of these. Okay. So in general, above this point are elements of universal grammar. Below this point our language particular bundling of that information. Lastly, let me show you the vocabulary items. So part of the way we get the distribution is we treat da as having an underspecified category. Okay, so this thing can be realized as focus, but it doesn't have to be. Negation of the relevant kind does have the category focus. The other negation, sa, has the category clitic. So notice that clitic is another possibility here. And the affixal negation has the category neg. Okay, and this is just showing the competition. So if we have a focus with the plus n feature, we have to get mai, tsai, or matcha because we don't have matching of that feature here or containment of that feature. If we have the additive feature, we have to get ta. Why? Because neg is overspecified. And again, if we have the clitic with the additive feature, we get ta. If we have the clitic with the negative feature, we get sa. Okay, thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Ash, for this talk. And do we have any questions? We have about 9 minutes for questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Ash. This is Oleg. The camera doesn't show the audience, so I'm introducing myself. Thanks for the interesting talk. I have a question about the first part of the talk where you said this is actually something new to me, that the semantics is no longer, it's part of the realizational part, right? So it means that can I interpret this as this is kind of a transition towards description by analysis rather than co-description, if I understood it correctly, that the vocabulary item contributes the semantics and not the syntax. So this seems to be a rather radical change, isn't it? So you get the feature, you realize the syntax, this is the F structure feature, the C structure head which introduces this feature, and you contribute the semantics in the VI, if I understood it correctly. So could you please comment on that?
Yeah. So okay, let me go to an example where we have some semantics. Okay. This will do. First, let me just interrogate something you said, which is that it's not really description by analysis. It's not examining the resulting F structure to see what to do. It's still co-description. It's co-bundled with the F structural information, right?
Well, yes, it is, but it's not in the C structure annotations, right? It's in a different step, in a different
Yes.
mapping. Yeah.
Okay.
So kind of
because
you need a feature to realize. That's what I mean by description by analysis, because you need an F structure feature to realize. You can't just contribute semantics on its own, right? You have to.
Oh, well, this thing could be 0. So it could be just the category that contributes.
Yeah, but in this sense, you mean that this category always has this semantics, right? So this
Right.
node is associated regardless of what lexical
Right.
item. Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, that sort of quibbling aside, we did this for a couple of reasons. First of all, we started feeling that having semantics as part of the matching for exponents is too powerful because semantics is such an open system. You can build anything, kind of, right? But also, we think we can capture all the previous effects we wanted in this sort of correlational way of doing semantics, right? So it still has the spirit of glue semantics in the sense that syntax and semantics can have mismatches. They can, and it's not the syntax that's driving semantic composition, but rather the glue terms, which I haven't shown here. But I think we can get all the same effects. And the other thing is we can still have semantic things in C structure, as in on nodes, for example, the way some people in glue semantics do English reduced relative clauses, like the guy I know, right? You just associate the relative clause semantics. Instead of associating it with a null relative pronoun, you associate it with the node the mother node of all that stuff. We can still have those kinds of annotations. It's just that semantics isn't part of the matching process anymore in terminal nodes.
Yeah, that's clear. I mean, that's a good idea, I think, actually. But I'm just not sure that you omit the glue site just because for space reasons, right? There's still supposed to be a glue site on the right.
Oh yeah. So there's
the linear logic site, yeah.
Yes, so there will be. This is actually like this.
Yeah, that's actually, I think that's a pretty good idea because, maybe the traditional glue, it allowed you to do a lot of stuff with this. And this kind of, you have a more direct connection with the F structure and with the C structure. I think but I mean, that has some ramifications for the interface.
It does.
Yeah. So I think
it also is a bit more true to the ethos of distributed morphology, or like the philosophical underpinnings of the theory, in the sense that you're realizing syntax.
It's the morphemes which have semantics and not the syntax which has the semantics independent.
But that also actually takes seriously the old structuralist notion of a morpheme as a minimal unit of meaning, right?
Yeah.
Morphemes have meanings, and people can identify these meanings. I mean, not things like the comparative because it's too complicated, but if you ask people what does a suffixed s on an English noun mean, they'll say plural. Right? So so I think it kind of captures two aspects of morphological theory that's to some degree correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any more questions? There is still 3 minutes remaining by the schedule. If not, I would allow myself to ask a small question related to what Oleg Igorevich was saying. So this is still compatible with the whole thing about constructional meaning that is, has been present since, I think, Mary Dorilpo's work.
Yes, because so the relative clause example I gave, right? This is an instance of constructional meaning. So basically, at this node, we introduce whatever you think the right relative clause semantics is, something like this. Right? So you get one property from the relative head, guy, you get the other one from the predicate, and you say it's intersected, right? And so that would be an instance of that constructional meaning you're talking about. Because so constructional meaning always lives in higher nodes, not in terminal nodes.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you. More questions? Then I also ask again. So is this these semantics and these lexical nodes they're compatible both with the adverbial usage of the comparative and the like pronominal usage, right?
So what do you mean by the adverbial usage?
Like sort of John runs faster than Bill, something like that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so all of these things are making space for a than clause that, so there's always an implicit than clause, basically, even if there's no explicit one. So if I say John runs faster, well, there better have been somebody else whose running speed we've been discussing in the discourse, right?
Yeah, we sort of can deduce it.
Yes.
Probably from previous discourse.
So there has to be some mechanism for deducing the that clause when it's missing. But it's still there in the sense of the meaning is still, you need it to have a comparative, because otherwise you don't have the other thing that's the standard of comparison. So this is a very standard sort of baby comparative semantics. We're not trying to get all the interesting facts about comparative and superlative semantics that people have been working on since Chris Kennedy's work. But it gets the basics right. It's enough to demonstrate that we can in principle do it.
Yeah, thank you. And it seems like we've reached 4 o'clock, and we can probably move on to the next talk. And we would, I think it would be nice to thank Ash once again.
Thank you very much. I will mute myself. Stop sharing.
Okay, I'm very happy to announce the author of the next talk, Danil Alexeyev, young and very promising researcher who is also the one of the organizers of this workshop. So his topic would be minimal phrase structure and discourse configurationality. Please, Danil.
Can I get a quick confirmation from Zoom that, oh, I can get confirmation from Zoom on my computer that everything can be seen. Ну, мне нормально и держать, но... Ну, вообще, да. Ну, мне и так сойдет. So, I think my talk will be probably the most sort of mathy and technical talk during today's workshop, but I'll try to still make a sort of typological point about certain kinds of languages, but at the same time, I would like to contribute about the way we formally analyze them. So I will examine properties of class structure in 2 languages, in Ossetic and Hungarian. These are both discourse configurational languages, and you'll see that the extended verbal projections that are used in the analysis of these languages are formalized with a bit of difficulty. And in LFG, one of the models for formalizing phrase structure is minimal phrase structure developed by John Lowe and Joey Lovestrand. And I'll show that if we reformulate it in terms of sets of features and not the way it is currently done, then probably we can get a better, more intuitive formalization of the properties of these languages. And a quick note about discourse configurationality. This term was first coined by Katalin Ekish. There is even a book titled Discourse Configurational Languages. And in such a language, certain positions are filled not by grammatical functions, but by discourse functions. And the definition that Ekish originally gave in the book, in the introductory chapter, included only topics and foci as the relevant discourse functions. But it seems like the number of these discourse functions can be a bit higher, and so there can be more specialized positions in the languages we consider discourse configurational. So as we can see, for example, in Ossetic, there are preverbal positions that are dedicated to negative pronouns and negation, but we're not going to talk about negation today. WH words and constituents and narrow foci. And Oleg Igorevich, in his 2022 paper, analyzed these positions as members of verbal projections beyond bar level 2. And this sort of analytical approach has been also present in work within the LFG framework since a series of works by Miriam Butt and Tracy King. And what is important is that these elements are subject to a strict linear ordering constraint. So in example 2a, which is translated as who knows nothing, the WH pronoun precedes the negative pronoun nisse, and the reverse order is not possible. If we are talking about, for example, the relation between foci and WH pronouns, you also can't reverse them. Example 3a, whose sound is our, you can't reverse the vocal noun phrase with the WH pronoun. And what seems important, and is actually the gist of this whole thing, of the problem with these elements, is that they can be introduced recursively. An example 4a from the Ossetic National Corpora, we have recursive negative pronouns. In example 4b, we have multiple WH pronouns, even 3 of them. And in example 4c, which was elicited by myself and some colleagues, some of which are present here today, we have multiple focal constituents. Then there is Hungarian. I'm taking the VP analysis by Ekish herself. And of course, there has been a lot of literature on the clause structure of Hungarian. And I'm taking this analysis for illustrative purposes because what it shows is that we have the negative marker appearing as a head adjunct to the verb, then a flat structure which features postverbal conditions. These postverbal constituents raise the bar level to 1, and then we have this cohort of foci, interrogatives, and negative constituents. So the main thing is why this analysis is simplified is because when you have, for example, a focal constituent and an interrogative constituent appearing, then there is sort of an optimality interaction between them, and this analysis does not, in this form, predict which constituent ends up in the preverbal position, and they're in complementary distribution in the preverbal position. But above that, we have quantifier phrases, which also includes adverbs like always, which we'll see in a later example. And again, you can see that these are introduced recursively above the site of introduction of foci, etc. And these QPs also cannot appear after the position which introduces foci, interrogatives, and negative constituents, but they can recur. This was indicated by the tree we saw on the previous slide. And on this slide, we can see an example following this paper by Bainey and Chisarek, that Mindig, which is exactly the type of adverb which belongs to the QP category and is introduced at the same site, it cannot follow a focal constituent. And so the pattern is similar to Ossetic in this regard, and if we sort of translate it into the same language that was used by Oleg Igorevich in his paper, then what we get is the continuing rise of bar levels, but the first introduction of a QP raises the bar level from 2 to 3, and then subsequent introductions maintain it. So it's sort of a mixed behavior. This thing behaves like a complement or a specifier in raising the bar level, while this thing behaves more like an adjunct. So this seems to be the interim conclusion we can reach here, that discourse configuration languages, at least those with the grammaticalized preverbal area. Of course, even Russian has been called a discourse configuration language, but the clause structure is very different, and we are talking about only languages of the type to which Hungarian and Ossetic belong. So they have special elements that exhibit mixed behavior, that have both the features of a complement or a specifier and an adjunct. And in Ossetic, every such constituent in the preverbal area has this property, and in Hungarian, this property can be postulated for the probable quantifier phrases. But in the later sections, I will only focus on analyzing osthetic. So in LFG, X-bar theory has been traditionally used for the formalization of C structure. But if we follow X-bar theory by the book, then what we get are cumbersome representations like the one in 8, where we have a large number of non-branching nodes. And traditionally, researchers within LFG used compressed representations like the one in 9, which reduces the number of non-branching nodes. And this is done in compliance with the principle of economy of expression. However, as the authors of the model, which I will describe later, note, this mechanism for the elimination of non-branching nodes, which was called data remission in a paper by Dirimpol, Kaplan, and colleagues, is not well defined from a formal point of view. And additionally, in LFG, stuff like non-projecting words, one-level categories, and the exocentric category S are widely used. And they also merit some form of special formal treatment. So this is where the model by Lafstrand and Lowe comes in. So they first called it minimal C structure, then rebranded it as minimal phrase structure. And its goal is to reach representations which are similar to the ones we find in bare phrase structure. So we want the sentence from the previous slides to look something like the sentence in 10, where we actually do not even have the non-branching N node, which is dominated by the NP. It is sort of subsumed in a single node, conflated. A technical preliminary for this model, the parallel architecture of LFG, following the work of Ronald Kaplan, holds that syntactic labels and bar levels are stored in a separate projection in the parallel architecture. And for example, you can use that to posit constraints on the syntactic category of some node in C structure rule annotations. So this is actually what technically the representation of a sentence we saw earlier looks like. So we have a special function, the lambda function, which maps nodes to matrices which contain syntactic categories and bar levels. Of course, I'm giving here only three mappings for some of the nodes present in this tree. And so we saw this bar feature in those matrices, but Lafstrand and Lowe proposed to replace the single bar feature with two separate ones. One called L level, which encodes current bar level, and P, which reflects the maximum projection level. So P stands for projection. And the values that the node can take for L and P are constrained via free structure rules annotations, like for example annotations for F structure, and they can be calculated in a bottom-up fashion, assuming that lexical nodes have their L level initially set to 0. But for illustrative purposes, we can write the L and P values as superscripts near the node label. So these are the rules according to which we can achieve the representation I was talking about earlier. So for example, the VP rule, first this is a typo here, you should use 1, because the rule for the VP says that the mother V inherits its P value from the daughter V node, and since we're attaching a complement, we want the daughter V to have an L value of 0 and the L value of the mother to be 1. and the annotations of the sort this node's L value is equal to this node's P value tells us that what we have is a fully built phrase, which we cannot and not need to attach something later on. And of course, we can introduce a complement for the NP as well in a similar fashion, and we can introduce a specifier for the noun phrase. This is also quite trivial. The specifier maintains that the mother's p-value of the projecting phrase is equal to its sister's p-value. Again, here I have a bit of a typo. This n should also have its p-value set to 2, as well as this n and this n node. And if we think about applying this theory to the aesthetic data, we have to maintain two essential properties: the strict linear ordering principle and recursion. And if we take the first property at face value, it requires the narrow foci, the WH and the negative constituents, to set the L value to some specific values. For example, the foci could set the L value to 3, WH could set the L value to 2, and so on. And if we have a configuration like a focal constituent followed by WH constituent with the negative pronoun missing, that means we would have a situation of skipping of values. And this does not seem satisfying from a theoretical point of view. And the constraint on the L value of the projecting head would have to be formulated disjointly. So for example, the WH rule would want its sister's L value to be either 0 or 1 or 2. Again, this is unsatisfying, but this fact itself is due to the fact that L and P values are not actual numbers. Larson and Lowe use some technical way of representing numbers, but you can't really define arithmetic on the way numbers are represented in this system. And so what we have is that the first introduction of a certain provable discourse function changes something about the L projectional content of the node, while the subsequent introduction does not. And there seems to be a mathematical object that can be said to sort of satisfy this description, and it seems to be the set. So if we presuppose that we take a union of two sets, and the second one is not empty, then their union is not the same as the initial set. But if we take the union of a set with two identical instances of a second set, this is of course equal to just the union of the original set with one instance of the second set. And it should be noted that sets are already part of the LFG framework. For example, you can use them in the description of agreement, as noted and well described in a manuscript by Louisa Sadler. And I would like to begin by reformulating what the rules for a standard complement specifier adjunct configuration should look like. So the complement rule maintains that the projection node's current L value is 0, and at the same time it sets the L featural content of the mother node to the set which contains the feature C. The rule for the specifier tells us that the projection node cannot currently have S as a feature which is a member of its daughter's feature content, and the adjunct just maintains the current L value. That is pretty trivial, but you can also notice how the set cardinality corresponds to the bar levels in the initial system. So if we have a set cardinality of 0, this corresponds to bar level 0, then bar level 1 corresponds to a set with cardinality 1, and etc. So in order to accommodate the requirement for a higher maximum projection level, which we see in Ossetic and Hungarian, we can introduce some new feature. I call it T, but the name is arbitrary. And for example, if you look at the rule for the introduction of negative pronouns, it is similar to a standard complement rule, but it checks the requirement on L. You should actually move this annotation below the verb because we're checking the current L value, and we are checking it to be an empty set, but modulo set containing C. And we can, I think, see an example representation. So this has two negative pronouns and WH pronoun. So the first WH pronoun has this check. This check is successful. Then the second WH pronoun follows exactly the same rule and performs the same check, which is also in effect. And then the WH pronoun, which is introduced higher, adds S to the featural content of the mother node. At the same time, it wants it to be so that T, which is introduced by foci, was not previously present in the featural content of the mother node. And here is a representation of an ungrammatical sentence in which the negative pronoun would precede the WH pronoun. So the WH pronoun adds S to the featural representation of its mother's L value. And then we want to perform a check with the rule for the negative pronoun that its mother's L value modulo a set containing C is an empty set. But of course, if we find the difference between this set and this set, it is not equal to an empty set. And so we can formulate the strict linear ordering principle found in Ossetic examples in simply structural terms. Then I'll come to my conclusions. So I try to show that if we reformulate bar levels in terms of feature sets, this can, again, allow us to better capture some word ordering and phrase structure constraints found in Ossetic. We can also potentially apply it to other discourse configuration languages, such as Hungarian, which I described before. But, of course, more work is required in that regard. So I think that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Okay, now it seems that we have 7 minutes for your questions, please. Okay.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. First of all, I really like your talk. Thanks. I'm not sure if I followed all the formal details, but I'd love to have a chance to examine the slides in detail. I have a question about discourse configurationality. So how do we distinguish between what I'll call discourse configurational narrow and discourse configurational broad? So what do I mean by discourse configurational broad? Even in non-discourse configurational, in the standard sense, languages like, say, English, we can only mess with the word order if we're doing some kind of information structural thing, right? So So you can't like say something like, I don't know, bagels Daniel loves in a neutral context, right? So this kind of leads me to a bit of a confusion about how this term should actually be operationalized in a language like Hungarian or Ascetic versus any other language, which also shows discourse effects for word order variation, despite not being a particularly free word order language.
Yeah, so I think in this regard, a few also remarks about Russian can be made, which I mentioned is considered this configuration language. But for Russian, for example, if I understand correctly, like the discourse configuration position is the spec of IP, and that it should be a topic. For English, it seems like we have, for example, a canonical position for the object, as in the complement of V. But for aesthetic, for example, we can't find such a canonical position. Of course, if we are talking about a neutral information structural utterance, like Daniel likes bagels, then of course the word order will be SOV, but we can also do it SVO. We can position a topical object or a neutral object from the information structural point of view post-verbally, but still there is no sort of canonical position for the object. So I think it is probably, if my understanding of discourse configurationality is correct, of course, is that we're talking about whether there is some canonicity in the positions of certain grammatical functions. And in Osetic, we don't really find any. In English, we do. In Russian, probably more so than in Osetic, but still we have like sort of a special position for information structural constituents. Yeah, but thank you for your question. I think it's the one that should probably be dealt with probably more rigorously.
Yeah, I think your idea that it has something to do with canonicity, if we can, define that somehow, is promising.
Okay, any other questions? Sorry.
Yeah, may I just comment a little bit on the Ossetic? I mean, according to my understanding of Ossetic, I'm not sure about Hungarian, and don't know Hungarian, but judging from the papers, it's more or less the same. So in Ossetic, basically, the word order is not SOV, it's topic focus V, right? And it just happens to be SOV in most cases because the subject happens to be the topic in most sentences, but you don't have to assume that sentences are canonical SOV. You don't need this notion of syntactic linear positions associated with subjects or objects. Although you do have constituency, like in English, you have the VP, but VP is something else. It's focus plus verb, or maybe negative pronoun plus verb, right? So I would say that through the discourse configuration languages, they are languages like this, where the word order is based on information structure, although of course there are mixed cases like Russian, for example, which is tricky because in Russian, of course, there seems to be some sort of a basic SVO order, but still the number of possibilities for displacement seems to be larger than in English. And well, there was the prosody plays a role as well, and we're investigating this for prosthetic. This is being investigated both by like David Erschler, for example, and by our group as well. So that gives some interesting results. But fundamentally, still syntactic. There's no disagreement on this. I just wanted to ask Daniel one question about the idea. I mean, it seems that basically you're introducing a third option, right? So you have one like way of attaching stuff to other stuff dependent in the X-bar theory, where you increase the level, you have a junction which keeps the level the same, and you are introducing a third configuration where you kind of increase once and then continue doing the same thing. And I wonder what else it can be useful for apart from discourse configurationality. And secondly, why is it better than just saying that we have multiple specifiers. For example, we just have a xp star asterisk, for example, v bar, and you will have also several things. For example, negative pronouns, you can just have a regular expression, and you can have more than one. So how is this better than having just multiple specifiers?
But for the second part of your question, you mean like in a flat structure?
Yeah, flat structure, but like you can have like one position for flat attachment of interrogatives in a setting. Then you can have, for example, complement is the interrogative, is the negative, and you will have neg p asterisk, for example, v, and then you can have above that wh asterisk, and you won't have to deal with
Yeah, sort of like for the preverbal, post-verbal constituents in Hungarian. In some tree I showed earlier, there was this rule for the introducement of post-verbal constituents, which is flat. But I think we have discussed this previously, and I asked you whether you can have some.
I'm getting old. My memory is false.
Whether you can have some constituent tests for those multiple NECPs, and
you can. But
you said that you can. And
yeah, you can. But on the other hand, I'm thinking that maybe you have non-constituent coordination, so you can sometimes coordinate stuff even if it's flat, or if it's not like right note raising or like this non-constituent stuff in English. So I mean, the coordination is good, but I'm not sure if the prosody interface, for example, is an argument in favor of binary branching. Or can be modal. I mean, I think like coordination is problematic in many respects. I mean, it's good. I agree that probably aesthetic has a binary branching. I'm pretty much sympathetic, but I just wonder what the arguments can be apart from coordination, because coordination is a bit tricky as an argument in favor of constituency. So yeah, maybe something else can be found. Prosody, I'm not sure you can. It helps you to model prosody if you have a binary branching structure for aesthetic, but that's something maybe to think about.
Yeah, probably we have to do some rigor work in order to define, to determine whether there is really binary branching. But if there is, then still we come to the same problem. But at least we would have some solution for the problem initially posed. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Daniel, thank you very much again.
Yeah, and I will announce that we now have a 12-minute, it seems, coffee break. Yeah, so a pyrishki break, yes. So for the Zoom participants, we'll again resume in 12 minutes. So it will be 16:45 UTC +3. So stay tuned.
Okay, welcome back to the second session of our workshop, and now we will discuss some more language particular topics, and the first talk will be presented by Oleg Belyaев. It is called Capturing Partangi Clause Structure in LFG.
Yes, thank you. Let me just see. Как полноэкранный режим включить?
Ctrl-A.
А потом в Zoom сделать, да? Okay, so just a moment, I'll share my screen. Thank you very much for the introduction. And yeah, my talk will be more data-driven, and there will be a little bit of formalization also in LRFG, but yeah, a little bit preliminary, but I think it's worth discussing. So basically, in this talk, I will first describe the clause structure of Bartangi, which will be shown to possess an unusually high number of distinct positions for functional material. And actually, this is also interesting from the point of view of what Ash asked during Danil's talk, what is discourse configurationality? And even though Bartangi is not discourse configurational, I think there are some issues which can be raised in this context by the data of Bartangi. And I will argue that adopting LRFG instead of vanilla LFG, standard LFG, allows us to make the number of these positions more manageable. So to make the clause structure even essentially more explanatory and more compact. And we can also shift the burden of distinguishing between positions in some ways to vocabulary items rather than C structure, which is done in standard LFG. And finally, the analysis that I would like to propose, I think, reveals a curious typological fact about the language, which is otherwise a little bit obscured by the quirks of individual subordinators. Some general information, sorry, no map. It's a shame. Usually you have maps, but I didn't have time to include it. So Bartangi is a language of the Pamirs. It's an aerial grouping of Iranian languages, and Bartangi in particular belongs to the Shugni-Roshani branch of the Eastern Iranian languages, spoken in the Bartang River valley of the mountainous Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast in Tajikistan. It's difficult to estimate the number of speakers, but in 1989 it was, because the last census, which included nationalities and native languages in Tajikistan, was in 1989. So we can only guess that the number has decreased since that time, maybe around 3,000, hardly more than that. It is generally a fairly typologically typical SOV language with left-branching noun phrase, word order, and the study is based on both published texts, which I include sometimes in the examples, and data collected during field trips in last year and this year summer to the village of Basid in the Rushan district of this mountain Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast. So the basic word order in Bartangi, as in other Iranian languages, is SOV. So for example, Pulot soy fox will be Pulot rups wind. And in 2, you can also see some interesting typological features of Bartangi, namely the fact that in the past tense, you have a second position clitic expressing the person and number features of the subject. So it's azum, azvi, hats, wind. So here you see that, first of all, the subject is I, and then it carries a first person singular agreement marker, as is typical for many Iranian languages, because it goes back to the ergativity in Middle Iranian. And then the direct object is marked by the preposition as, which is used for definite objects, and also this Rats has some kind of a definite article, demonstrative used as a definite article accompanying it. So it's the boy, not that boy necessarily, but the boy which was mentioned in the preceding discourse. And the verb stands in the past stem. So you say that you see that the third person is 0 marked, but the first person is marked by the second position clitic. But while for other Pamir languages, word order is usually described as pretty strict SOV. But in Bartangi, this is not the case, because in Bartangi, in fact, arguments may appear in any order, and this has been observed already by Sokolov, especially if DO, if the direct object is marked by this as. So it's similar to Ra in Persian, but a bit freer, because in Persian Ra is a necessary requirement, but while in Bartangi, for example, in 4, Pulot wind troops is okay too. And 3, by the way, is taken from a real example when our hosts were discussing the championship, the football championship, and there was a situation when Georgia defeated Portugal, and they said, "As Portugalia Gruzia ayot." So he used OSV word order in this example. That's really a living example, because apparently as Portugal was the topic, apparently in this case. However, it's not a discourse configuration language in the sense that Ossetic is, because word order is always strongly preferred to be SOV, even in questions and answer pairs, which are generally fairly good diagnostics for topic and focus status. For example, in 5, Hujit Polosi, he saw Assad, sorry, no political connotations here, it's just one of our, a typical name in this region. So Hujit Polosi, he saw Assad, so here the topic is the Pulot, and the focus is Assad, and the word order is SOV, but in 6, even though the focus should be the subject, and in Ossetic, for example, in this case, the answer would have been OSV. Right, because the subject is the focus is preverbal, and the topic is initial. So theoretically, you could have expected that it would be as Assad, Pulot wind, but this is not the case. Both in the question and the answer, you just have double H. In the question, you have double H in situ in all cases. In the answer, you generally have SOV, regardless of the information structure, just like in the English translations. Therefore, Bartangi is not a discourse configuration language like Ossetic or Hungarian, which were presented in the previous talk by Danil. Clitics show some peculiar features of distribution. First of all, I would like to mention again that in the present tense you have endings rather than clitics. So, for example, in 7 you have just vinum, IC, where the person marker attaches just to the verbal stem, but in 8 we see that in the past tense it's second position, azumas pulot wind, right? And here we see that it's the second position, and the only case where the clitic appears on the verb is if the verb occupies somehow the first position in the clause, like in 9. Win tomazi, I see him, I did it. Some sort of a predicate topicalization construction. In this case, the clitic can appear on the verb. And the question, as in most clitics, is whether it is syntactic or the rules for placement of the clitics are syntactic, prosodic, or maybe a mixture of both. In fact, in Bartangi and Peace, have a very peculiar structure because the Bartangir has a very reduced case system. It's basically with nouns have no case distinctions at all, whereas pronouns, as in many other Iranian languages, they have a two-case system. And also nouns accompanied by demonstratives distinguish case, but not bare nouns. So for example, if you say Pulot's house, it will just Pulot house, Pulot chot, without any morphology, only the word order determines. And so for example, there is no formal distinction between Pulot's house and a good house, Pulon chot, Bashan chot. And if there's a pronoun, of course, it will take the oblique case, we chot, his house, and the nominative is ya. And such NPs, of course, well, maybe not that expectedly, but such NPs are never broken up by clitics, like in 12. So you can only say Pulot chodum wind, I saw Pulot's house, but you can't say Pulodum chod wind, right? So you can't insert the clitic within such noun phrases. And it could be argued, in fact, that this shows that clitic placement is syntactic. So it stands up to the first NP. However, it could be the case that actually these NPs have one stress. It's actually not something which has not been investigated, but for aesthetic, for example, I have previously assumed that NPs have multiple stresses, but now there is some empirical data which shows that in aesthetic, all NPs have just one stress. It's basically one prosodic word. And so maybe in Bartangi it's the same thing, because in Bartangi, as we see, there are restrictions on how many constituents, how many dependents you can have. So for example, Pulot Bashan Chert is judged as ungrammatical by many speakers because you have two unmarked strings in the preverbal, in the prenominal position, and somehow there's either a prosodic conflict or a syntactic one. We don't know, but in general, it could be assumed that perhaps this has to do with how noun phrases are prosodically phrased. But Bartangi has another possessive construction, maybe which has grammaticalized in order to overcome this lack of case. There's a special possessive suffix "a", which actually, by the way, exists in some Tajik dialects. It's maybe related to Ra, but it's not clear at all, because other Shugni Roshani languages do not have this "a". It has a different marker in this construction. So you have Pulot in this possessive marker, which is doubled by a pronoun. So to Pulot, his house, right? To Pulot, his good house, like the Turkic Kazafi construction. And in this case, it's important to note that in this case, you can, in fact, put the clitic either after the possessive noun, Jonaliya, Yum, Wichot, Dver, Wind. I saw the door of Jonali's house, and so you can either put the clitic after the possessor, or you can put the clitic after the whole group, which seems to. And there are other constituents which are impenetrable for clitics, even though they clearly have more than one prosodic word. For example, in 16, I like eating meat, meat eating I like. You can only put the clitic after the infinitive and not after the object of the infinitive, which in my opinion speaks against a purely prosodic analysis. So there might be prosodic factors involved in this, for example, with the bare dependence, but in many cases we have to assume that what precedes the clitic is a syntactic constituent rather than a prosodic word. And it's interesting that the clitic generally marks the subject because it's the SOV language, but not necessarily so. And in fact, other arguments can appear before the clitic, but there is an important restriction. There seems to be a restriction on this, namely that if the element preceding the clitic is not the subject, it has to be the topic. So for example, in 17, the subject is the focus. But it can still appear before the clitic because it's just the canonical SOV word order, right? Who saw Assad? I saw Assad. Azum as Assad went, right? And I clear is the focus because it's the answer to a narrow focus, because it's an answer to a constituent question. But in 18, where the question is to the direct objects, it's not felicitous to use the OSV word order. It's not felicitous to say as Assadum as wins, right? You have to, so the position before has to be the topic if it's not the subject. With the subject, this rule is overridden, so it's still SOV. But if it's not this, not the subject which appears before this person number clitic, it has to be the topic in the sentence. And in general, maybe examples like this are not that frequent. It's more typical to see topical adverbs in such positions, like in 19, yesterday I saw you. So biyorumaz astavint. Yes, so you still have SOV order, but the clitic is put on some sort of adverb which appears close initially. So apparently we have to distinguish in Vartangi between the topic position, which is kind of a bit higher, and but we still have a configurational SOV structure in the language, and that's why my preliminary proposal at this stage is the following phrase structure. So we have some sort of a dedicated topic position in spec IP, then we have the clitic in the second position, then we have the subject, object, verb configurational VP structure. And what happens here is the clitic either remains in situ if there is something for it to attach to, or if there is nothing in spec IP, since it's the clitic, it undergoes prosodic inversion, like in Halpern's analysis of clitics. So it goes after the following prosodic word. So that explains why the clitic can alternately appear on the topic and on the subject. And I assume that non-SOV word orders, apart from this topicalization construction, are due to topicalization or scrambling. So a junction to some sort of VP internal positions. Now we'll look at the positions of subordinators, because it's a very rich system of subordination. It's a very poor system in terms of the elements themselves, but the system of their positions is very rich. So there are two close internal subordinators, which I call ца and D2 because of the Sokolova's dictionary, which has it as a second entry. And these appear inside the clause and have a very wide polysemy pattern. So it can be temporal clauses, relative clauses, correlatives in most cases, various kinds of manner clauses, and so on and so forth. Conditionals, they are all expressed by ца and D. It's very complex semantic distribution. There's a paper in Вопросы языка знания which has been accepted and which is due to appear next year, and hopefully there you will be able to read what I think about the semantics. But for now we carry on about the syntax, and we can see that in 20 ца is preverbal, and in 21 D here it appears in the second position. So тут ди машри базай гарагдачук машти хошсан. And here D appears in the second position. And for those who know Persian, you can notice that it's similar to ke when it appears, when it introduces a clause which precedes the main clause. And I will talk about this at the end of the talk as well. So these are the internal subordinates, and there's also this initial subordinated D, also sounds D. So it's like Persian ki, which has two different positions. So here D sounds the same, but it has a totally different position and totally different semantics. It normally introduces complement clauses, like in 22, Mualim fikri chuk D. Mashti Khudar Shoyan. So here D attaches to the chuk prosodically. So it's an enclitic, like fek kart ki, which is also enclitic, right? And here, like in Persian, there's an interesting parallel, which is probably not accidental. And this D is traditionally viewed as an initial subordinator, but there are many good reasons to assume that it's something more vague. And in many contexts, it's not even clear that it introduces a subordinate clause, like in 23, where there's a huge pause between this D and the following clause. So when the old times went hunting D, there was a prayer, where he kind of continues the preceding clause, but D doesn't really seem to introduce any. In fact, it follows the subordinate clause formally because it has ца. So it's not really possible to analyze D in such examples as a subordination marker. And I argue in this paper that it's actually some sort of a clause final particle rather than a subordinator. And we also have so-called coordinating conjunctions, hu and at. In general, hu marks, so yesterday we had a talk in the Iranian section on Shugni about these conjunctions by Polina and Maxim. But in Bartangui, the properties are a bit different, but in general, it's similar in the sense that hu marks sequential events, while at marks simultaneous ones. And at is also the conjunction which conjoins noun phrases. I will talk about their properties a bit later. So now about the properties of this conjunction. So ца is similar to the ascetic preverbal subordinators in the sense that it's strictly preverbal and can only be separated from the verb by negation. So when they came, I called them wad and sayat. So ца is an proclitic and the stress is on yat. In 26, it's separated from the verb by negation. So ца na yach is one prosodic word until he came. While ца itself is preverbal, the verb to which it attaches can be freely positioned in the clause, like in normal Bartangui word order. So 27, for example, ibot dars dot tonas ца na yach pulot. So you can put the subject pulot to the end of the clause, it's still fine. However, when ца is used in a clause that has no overt verb, for example, in a nominal predication construction when there is no copula, this ца appears on its own, without the verb, just ца. And in this case, it has to be strictly clause final. So, for example, in 28a, pul ta yatsa, dikmati chot biröcht vardi. It's a correlative clause, so the money that you have, you can build a house. It means with it, you can build a house. And here, ца just stands on its own in the end of the clause. And you can't put, for example, taya, the possessive form, after ца. So ца here has to be strictly at the end of the sentence. And to me, this seems to suggest, in terms of kind of the future analysis, which will be at the end of this talk, that ца is fundamentally clause final. As for D, it has two positional options. I mean, the clause internal D. It can be second position or it can be preverbal. So, for example, in the sentence, when you give us toys, we are happy, you can either say, tut di mashri bazai garak dachuk, mashti hoshsan. Or you can say, tut mashri bazai garak di dachuk, mashti hoshsan. So it's either preverbal like ца, or it's second position after the first constituent. Thank you. The second position, D, is not the same as the person number clitics, however, because it always follows the clitic, as seen in 29. It's always D and not dit. And second, it cannot stand after the verb if the verb is clause initial, unlike the person clitics, which we saw can do this. And D is similar to ца because it's also proclitic, but if they both appear in the clause together, the order is always D ца and not ца D. And finally, I just don't have time to talk about this in detail, but I would like to say that in my opinion, this who, which is considered to be and, is in fact a subordinating conjunction which introduces a subordinate clause, a temporal clause. Because, for example, you can have a sentence like, I hit the pigeon with a stone and it became wounded, which formally sounds like the pigeon became wounded, I hit it with a stone and. So here, this and actually stands at the end of the sentence and introduces the temporal clause. And it's not a coordinating, it's just a clause final subordinator. So I'll skip the other coordination tests and go to the generalization that we are left with. So we have looked at in the beginning of the talk, we looked at the general Bartangui clause structure, and we saw that we have this second position. And now we have a huge number of other elements which occupy various positions. So we have a second position for person number clitics. We have a second position for D, which is clause internal. We have two preverbal positions for D and Tsa. We also have clause final positions for the other D, for who, and for Tsa when it is in nominal predication. So I will skip the information about LR of G because we saw it in Ash's talk. And I will operate on the assumption that, first of all, if two elements are in complementary distribution, they are in the same C structure position. And second, that the same functional information is expressed in only one syntactic position. So you don't, unless you have to, you don't want to say that we have two different positions for the same functional element. And so for the person clitics, we can use LR of G's host ident plus features to say that if the tense of the clause is present, then the exponent has host ident plus, it jumps. So it's always expressed in I in the second position node, but if the tense is present, it has to jump onto the verb because of this host ident plus feature. Whereas if the tense is past, it just remains in its normal position. And this p frame feature, sorry if the picture is incorrect, it basically says that it's a syllable which has to be at the end of a prosodic word. It has to attach to the end of a prosodic word. It's an enclitic. As for the final elements, like I assume that who and D occupy some sort of final C position, which is typologically common for OV languages, but not very common for Iranian. Even though yesterday we heard Arseny Wydyrin's talk where he also has some final markers in Yagnobi. But I argue that this Tsa, which is normally preverbal, should also be viewed as fundamentally occupying the same close final position due to its strictly final position in nonverbal predication. But this Tsa also has the host ident plus feature, which means that it also normally jumps to the verb, right? It moves to be preverbal. But if there is no host, then it doesn't have the option of precliticizing to the verb, and it remains in its standard position, which is a bit difficult to formalize in current LR of G, but for now, I have this not very elegant solution that says that it has another exponent, which is a prosodic word on its own, if there is no verb in the clause, that there is no V category in the inverse mapping from the F structure to the C structure. As for the two positions of this D, we have to assume that it's in the same position, but it can be either second position or preverbal. And I propose to say that it's an initial subordinator, in fact. But it's prosodically deficient. It's always an enclitic. That's why if it's an enclitic, it undergoes prosodic inversion always because it's in the beginning of the clause. It has nothing to attach to. But if it is, it has a second realization, which says that it has host ident plus, thank you, and a p frame that says that it has to have a host on its right. It has to be at the beginning of a prosodic word. Therefore, it has two options. Either it is an enclitic, and then it jumps after the first constituent, or it's a proclitic, and it attaches to the preverbal position. So we are left with such a structure which has one position for initial subordinators, which are always prosodically inversed, one position for the final subordinators, and these two positions, they basically are able to account for all the behavior, all this complex behavior of subordinators in Bartangui. And one example of a sentence, so here we see that the mapping to these structures, so we see that Paharahum did as Tsayat when I went to Harok, and here to Harok all hosts the pronominal, the person number enclitic, then this initial subordinator undergoes prosodic inversion after this enclitic, and this final subordinated Tsa undergoes movement, not movement, it's not correct to call it movement, mapping to the preverbal position, mapping to the V structure. And the treatment of Tsa as a final subordinate allows us to explain some puzzling facts about Bartang's syntax. So I would like to finish by saying what are the advantages of LRFG over standard LFG in this sense, is that we can drastically reduce the number of syntactic positions, and we can also assume that their morphosyntactic and prosodic behavior is predicted not by the C structure, which is quite difficult to stipulate several positions, but by the properties of the vocabulary items themselves, that is the properties of the subordinators. So we shift the burden to the lexical items which are stored in the dictionary. And I think that's a simpler analysis than standard LFG, but it still leaves open the question of why there are still so many positions. It's not common to find a language with an initial subordinator and a final subordinator, right? So that's what we are left with. And my answer is that the explanation is actually diachronic, because this preverbal Tsa is very similar to the Ossetic preverbal subordinators, as I mentioned, and it could be a common East Iranian feature, because we have a similar situation in Ossetic also with the coordinating conjunctions, which can be viewed as kind of close final subordinators. And we saw yesterday in Arseny Vidrin's talk that Yegnobi also has final subordination markers. But D is actually a replication of Tajik Ki, because Tajik Ki exactly, it's either clause initial or Persian as well, or it stands in the second or preverbal position of the subordinate clause, and this is described, for example, in Paris descriptive grammar. And so we can say that D, it has been pattern copied from Tajik, and that's why Bartangui introduced an additional clause initial complementizer position in addition to the final position that it had due to its original story of the development of subordination. And unlike distributed morphology, where the hierarchy of projections is fixed and universal, LRFG allows us to model clause structure as a language-specific phenomenon that is subject to diachronic change, grammaticalization, and pattern borrowing. At the same time, it dispenses with the rigid lexicalism characteristic of vanilla LFG, which is, in my opinion, a good thing for such phenomena which involve, and at the same time, just one more point that I would like to make, that what's important is that it doesn't, the way that you can move items is very restricted. So you can only have prosodic motivated movement, and you can have jumping onto the host, onto the closest head. So the degree to which we actually introduce some sort of post-syntactic displacement is quite restricted, and I think this is, well, also a good idea and helps in the analysis of such language-specific data. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks a lot. And now we are open for your questions. The first question is from Zoom, I guess, or not? From the audience? Or okay.
Thank you, Oleg. A great talk, as usual. A few questions. Are there clitic clusters in Bartangui or not? That's the first tiny question. And the second one is concerning the examples where D and Tsa apparently take adjacent position. So are they placed in the same syntactic domain or in different domains? And that moves me to my final third tiny question. Is it a good taxon initial in clitic? Just looks rather playful. If you call something enclitic, then it has to join to the preceding part of the utterance. So enclitics are, in a way, never initial.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Well, as for the first question regarding the clusters, second position clitics don't really cluster as far as I know, although it has to be more explored in more detail. The thing is that there is also the future habitual clitic in the second position, T, but they're in complementary distribution because it occurs in the present tense verbs. So they always go, in this case, the person number clitic always goes to the verb. As for the class, but the final ones, you can have both. Well, you can sometimes have both Tsa and Hu, but then Tsa goes to the verb. So it's not really, you don't really have clusters. As for the second question, they appear in different syntactic domains because D is here, is final, and Tsa is, so D is here initial, and Tsa is final. But they both have hosted ident plus, so they both go on the verb, but this is lower, so it goes first, and this is higher, so it goes before that. And as for the third question regarding the initial clitic, well, yes, but on the other hand, as we all know, in some languages, clitics sometimes appear close initially, like in ossetic when you have this weak clitic climbing, where the clitic actually stands at the close boundary. And I think you told me about some examples from South Slavic where you also had similar situations. So I think it's reasonable to say. Yeah. Yeah, well, in ossetic, they're still enclitics. They're just encliticized to whatever word of the main clause happens to be to the left. And that's why it's reasonable to say they're initial. So for the Tangi, yes, one of the questions to investigate is how we can actually, falsify or confirm this hypothesis. But right now, it's it always displaces. But maybe it's maybe it's justified by additional data. Let's see.
Yeah, any more questions?
Ash also has, but yeah.
Yeah, I have a more general question. In your last slide, you said that your approach dispenses with the rigid lexicalism characteristic of LFG, but isn't lexicalism, as the name says, somehow a necessary component of lexical functional grammar, and also dispenses sort of sounds as if this were some extra thing that would be good to get rid of, but somehow, I thought it was sort of a good thing that distinguishes LFG from other approaches, right? I mean, that was at least the idea in 1982 that there are lexical rules and that distinguishes LFG from the transformational approach.
Yeah, thanks. Well, there are two senses in which you can be lexicalist, and I think the first sense, like about lexical rules and stuff, and the role the lexicon plays, is still kept here because it's still all in the lexicon. All these vocabulary items, they are there, and the argument structure is also in the lexicon. What I think it dispenses with is the idea that the terminal nodes of trees are always complete morphological words. So it dispenses with this idea that morphology is some extra module which assembles morphemes, and they go into the syntax wholesale without any modification. So this one it dispenses with, but maybe not lexicalism in the kind of more broad sense. But in the narrow sense, yes, it does. And actually, it was never part. It was always like just a stipulation that we know what morphology is. It's like an assumption that we know what a word is. So let's work with this. But I think you can do LFG without this assumption. It's not really that essential. Unlike the lexicalism which you're talking about, which indeed is a core feature which is still retained in LRFG, I would say. I think Ash had a question, yeah?
Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk, Oleg. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oops, I'll switch my camera on too. So I had a question about the conjunction. Can you go to your first slide about conjunction?
About the coordinating conjunction, or?
Well, the one where you introduce both.
The one, sorry?
The slide where you introduce both kinds of conjunction,
yeah.
who and the other one.
Yeah, here it is, yeah. Maybe this one, yeah?
So which is the one where you mentioned one can do NP conjunction, but the other one can't?
Yeah, it's before that, yeah. Yeah, here it is, yeah.
Okay, so the at one just looks like regular polymorphic.
Yeah, I think it's just a normal coordination, so it's, yeah.
And the fact that it can mean and or but, I mean, but just means and the rest is implicature anyway. But,
yeah, it's a bit unusual. That's what, also was mentioned yesterday, the Iranian section about Shugni, that, having both and but is unusual, but it seems that they are polysemous in this language, yeah.
Yeah. So the other one, who,
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused. Why was it ever considered a coordinator?
Because it's translated as E in Russian. The simple question
That's
is the
not
Russian
a good
translation
reason,
is
Oleg.
because it's used in the discourse as a coordination marker. I think it's actually, it's a typical North Eurasian thing where you have subordinate, like converbs in Dagestanian languages or in Southeast, and here you have a subordinator which is used for discourse subordination. Yeah, I think it's basically, it's just the fact, first of all, the Russian translation, and second, that, it's a discourse thing. You chain clauses in the discourse using this thing, so it can't be subordinating. It should be coordinating, right?
Yes, but I think what it really means is something like, as far as I can tell, based on your examples, is something like and so, which in English can also collapse into just so.
Not necessarily so. It can be just a sequence. So in this case, yeah, you have.
Well, no, I mean, so is actually very polysemous. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's just talking about a sequence, and sometimes it's got some kind of causal thing involved. So it's more like a storytelling. So you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Yeah,
so
more
in
or
English,
less.
I could say,
Yeah.
in English, I could say, Pulod came to the repairman, and so the repairman replaced his.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. But it's subordinating. That's the difference.
It's subordinating, yeah. So I agree with your analysis. I think that this thing is clearly not a conjunction. I mean, not a coordinating conjunction.
Yeah, because of examples like this, where you put it at the end. It became wounded and. So I threw a stone and.
Yeah, I mean, in some English dialects, you can even get something like so in that position. So
Wow.
again, it's
So English is exotic.
English is exotic. It's a mutt. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for your discussion. Let's greet Oleg once again.
Thank you.
And now we move to our second talk, which will be presented by Timoфей Дедов. And the talk will be about reciprocity in АБЗ. Timoфей, you're welcome.
Так, я должен быть микрофон. Тебе нужно будет держать микрофон. Да, точно как-то. Так, я могу вас щелкать микрофон. Да. Спасибо.
Okay, hello to everyone. My talk is dedicated to verbal reciprocals in АБЗ. And before the talk, I would like to thank АБЗ seminar in НИУ ВШЭ and also ЛФГ seminar in MSU. Yeah. And Open Russia Fund, who sponsored the expedition. Nice. Okay, so АБЗ language, it's Northwest Caucasian language, and it has two dialects, Tapanta and Ashkarawa. And my talk will be dedicated to Ashkara dialect, and also actually the name of the talk is not exactly right because some people claim that Ashkara dialect is closer to Abkhaz language and should be treated as Abkhaz dialect instead of АБЗ dialect. I would remain neutral on this issue. Just please remember that everything that I would say later would be about Ashkara dialect and not about АБЗ language in general. And it's spoken in Karachay-Cherkessia. Here is a map. Okay, let's talk a bit about Ashkara dialect of АБЗ language. It's a polysynthetic language, so it has complex verbal morphology and a relatively free word order, and also noun phrases are optional. Here is a template of the verbal morphology from Arkadiev, yet unpublished work. So in this talk, for us would be important ergative prefix, direct object prefix, and absolutive prefix, which has their positions before the root. Yeah, and also it's a language with ergative alignment, which is common. Okay, let's just look at the examples of АБЗ sentences. Here is Ahmed likes Fatima with like ergative prefix for Ahmed. Yeah, for Ahmed, and human absolutive prefix for Fatima. Hope it's clear. Yeah, also these noun phrases are optional, as I already said. And the second sentence is a sentence with indirect object, where we have benefic prefix which glosses as Ben, and female indirect object prefix for MXHAN. Yeah, this construction just states that Fatima made address for MXHAN. Also, in this verb, there is no absolutive prefix because in a beta language, absolutive prefix can be omitted if absolutive argument if its position right before the verb. Hope it's also clear. And so there are some yet unresolved questions about a beta language. First of all, if we are talking about LFG, it's still unclear is absolutive argument should be subch or obj. In this talk, I will assume that it's subch in F structure, like in work of Lander, Belyaev, and Горбунова. Oi, sorry. Yeah, I mean Begirokova, of course. Sorry. But for example, Panova treats it's like an obj function in F structure. And also it's hard to test this because many of the tests, for example, from Iguda Falk, it's hard to test here because of the structure of complex clauses in a beta language. I won't elaborate on that, just a fact. And also status of these affixes, of absolutive affix, ergative affix, and indirect object affix also is not very clear because some scientists, for example, like Yuri Lander, thinks that it's a pronominal argument, while for others, for example, like Yershova, it's just an agreement morphology. And even if we think that it's an agreement morphology, we may think that real arguments are expressed with like zero arguments, and noun phrases are just adjuncts or something. Or we can think that noun phrases are the real arguments. It's an open question. Yeah, but in this talk, I would be thinking that it's pronominal arguments. About its reciprocity reflexivity, I think everyone knows this, but just in case, reciprocity, it's a grammatical category that expresses mutual character of situation, like they kissed each other. I don't know, Boris and Masha kissed each other means Boris kissed Masha, Masha kissed Boris. So it's just a mutual thing. And reflexivity, I think it's also very clear. Yeah, it's when my action is self-directed. So like I blame myself, which means I am the person that I am blaming now. Also, reflexivity and reciprocity could be divided into lexical and verbal. Lexical reciprocity or reflexivity is when we express this grammatical category with some lexems, like for example, друг друга in Russian or each other in English. And verbal, it's when we express it via the verbal morphology. So we would be talking about verbal reciprocity and reflexivity. Again, there are some something that we can find in Ashkara dialect. Lexical reciprocal is pronoun ach, which is formed on the base of numeral 1. Yeah, it's like 1 with some affixes. And aba is a prefix for morphological reciprocals. Also, it can be expressed like a or I, which I hope I would elaborate later on that. And lexical reflexive is pronoun cat or something like that. And it's from the stem with the meaning head, which is also not uncommon. Yeah. And morphological reflexive, it's prefix ch. So here are some examples. You can see here that reciprocal prefix appears on the position of ergative prefix. yeah, after the absolutive prefix and before the stem of this verb. And also it cannot agree. Yeah, it's ABBA wherever the other arguments would be. And absolutive prefix appears on the position, reflexive prefix appears on the position of an absolutive prefix. As an example for mother washed herself, mama шилк в обед. And so here's a question, because reflexive affixes can never appear in the position of an ergative prefix, and reciprocal affixes can never appear in the position of an absolutive prefix. So we should do something to explain that. Rather, we assume that they have different nature, or find some another explanation. So my talk is dedicated to the question what this explanation could be. I think most common analysis of reciprocity, at least for me, from the word of Bruning and the like, where he treats them like some valency changing operators. Yeah, something like voice. But in my opinion, this is not enough here, because still it cannot express why it's appear in the place of ergative and not somewhere else. Plus, it cannot be treated as valency decreasing operation, because we can also use reciprocals with intransitive verbs, and plus they can appear with lexical ach. So yeah, we should somehow explain that. It's totally not a valency decreasing operation. In my opinion, it could be better to talk about reciprocals and baza in the terms of bounding, especially if we treat them like pronominal arguments. Yeah, we can just simply state that it's acting like bounded pronouns of some sort or something like that. Yeah, here are some examples with different configurations. For example, absolutive and indirect object. Yeah, so search, like look for, is a verb which has only absolutive argument and also indirect object. Yeah, here's a mistype. It's Recyerk here, clearly. Yeah, not M. And also ergative and EO, where ergative affix and reciprocal affix is co-referring, right? They give present to each other. And absolutive argument just present. And this is for, yeah, so as we can see, we already saw that absolutive and ergative could be co-referential like this, where reciprocal in the place of ergative. Also, absolutive and indirect object could be co-referential like this, and ergative indirect object. And here are some example with causative. Yeah, so here at the example 9, Fatima and Raifat introduced Ahmed and Rashid to each other. Absolutive argument and indirect object argument also co-referring. And here we have also ergative argument, which is distinct from them. So we can make this. Yeah, let's look at this here. We can have binary relations like this, where absolutive can bind indirect object, and also absolutive can bind ergative, and ergative can bind indirect object. And for reflexives, it's vice versa, where ergative binds absolutive. Yeah, there were some previous analysis, like reciprocal affix is a decreasing valency operator, but just like I said, it seemed wrong to me because, and Yershova also has some arguments against it, because it can combine with any verb, even intransitive, so it's not valency decreasing. Also, Podobryaev on a seminar of Laboratory of Formal Models and Linguistic analyzes reciprocal affix like an incorporated pronoun that can blitz ergative agreement, but this approach cannot explain what happens with situations where reciprocal affix in the place of indirect object. And also Yershova thinks that it's an instance of an accusative alignment, like it's ergative alignment with reflexives and accusative alignment in reciprocals, but I don't see enough evidence for this in the history of language or something. And plus, I can't really see how this can be used in intransitive verbs, for example. So yeah, I once again show you these binding patterns. And I think LFG is great for explaining such data because in LFG we have different structures like F structure and structure for semantics. So we can just assume that reciprocal affix is bounding arguments according to F structure. Yes, so subject can bind object, and object can bind object theta, and subject can bind object theta. And the reflexive affix is bounding arguments according to semantic prominence. We can express it in A structure, or if we want to get rid of it, like in the almost every late LFG analysis, we can try to do it with derivations in glue semantics, I think. I'm not really sure how to properly formalize it, but I hope it's possible. Maybe someone can say to me something about this later. So yeah, this is basically the claim that we can use different structures in LFG to formalize two different binding patterns, which is hard to achieve in other frameworks where we have only one structure. Also, I made some addendum, I don't know. Arkadiev, Leduchin, Begirokova cite an example where reciprocal prefix used just as applicative, so it's applicative prefix. Here, yes, there is clearly no reciprocal semantics. It's not productive pattern now, but it appears in some verbs. And also, Lander for ADIC cites some data. In ADIC, there is also reciprocal, of course, it's the re. And Lander shows some data how it can be analyzed not as just reciprocal, but it's reciprocal prefix and applicative. Like here, where we have reciprocal EO here and simply reciprocal applicative here, because they're not coming together. So maybe if we remember about this example and this data, we can also state that in ABA it's also not just ABA reciprocal, but here's valency change in operation and a reciprocal prefix. Yeah, and it I should study more to make this claim, but I think it has some good points. For example, ach, which is, as I said already, lexical reciprocal, can be an absolutive argument, like here, where there is no absolutive argument because ach is here, right? Like I said before. So once again, it would be strange if verbal reciprocal affix can be anyway but absolutive, and lexical reciprocal can be absolutive. So maybe in ABA we can find actually two morphemes, where one is just reciprocal and the other like reciprocal indirect object, and the other is an applicative prefix for reciprocals. And that would mean that when aba appears in the position of an ergative prefix, it's actually not ergative, but it's still indirect object with applicative. Yeah, and that would explain, that would be in consistency with ADIC data, and also would explain this, if it could be applicative in some point of time. Yeah, but for now, I just ready to state that I think that we can analyze them like bounded polynomial arguments, and their bounding is due to semantic structure or F structure, which once again is easily done in LFG. Thank you for your attention. That's all.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a brief fact, which I think I mentioned during the seminar, but I think it's worth mentioning because there are some people who work on Dargwa here, because I found exactly the same pattern in Ashti, where reflexives are bound in the accusative pattern. For example, Ali Barasul, Цин Наца, or Цин Дилца. So one another, Цин Дилца. It's Dil is ergative, Silsa. So you no Rasul Ahmad Li Barasul Li. So you have ergative absolutive, but in reciprocals it's the other way around. So it will be Ahmad Barasul, Sindilsa, Butsai, for example, quote each other. So you have like the noun phrase is in the absolutive and the pronoun is in the ergative. But with the reflexive is the other way around. The noun phrase is in the ergative and the reflexive is in the absolutive. So I think there is something going on here with reciprocals in some languages.
Yeah, I think
of the Caucasus at least.
maybe
So I
it's
think,
better
yeah.
to study deeply into reciprocal semantics or something like that to find the answer, but I don't know yet.
Or maybe they are somehow more syntactic and they're more absolutive
Yeah, but
oriented.
there should be then the reason why it's the most syntactic. I
True,
don't know.
true. Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's worth some typological study or
Yeah.
some sort, maybe later. Thank you very much.
Are there any more questions in the audience? Well, this is a Zoom question. So yeah, if there are no questions in the audience, I think maybe Ash, you can speak.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. So I'm trying to think of what it would mean for a reciprocal to be a valency changing operation, and I'm failing. It seems to me that when one thinks about reflexives and reciprocals, they play dual functions, which Abaza really highlights. One is that they do something to the verb. The other is that they have to be bound by something so that we understand who's involved in the mutual relationship or the reflexive relationship, right? But it seems to me that the reciprocal in this language is just turning a verb into a verb that expresses mutuality, basically. X did to Y and Y did to X, right? But I didn't hear you consider whether the reflexive is valency reducing, which is also tempting, right? Because then the reflexive just basically turns the verb into something that has two identical arguments. So like, you know, it takes it from a verb that says like lambda y, lambda x, verb xy, to one that just says lambda x, verb xx. So do you think any of this could help you with any of what you were looking at?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure that I understand everything that you said to me, but well, since as you said, reflexive do something with an argument structure of a verb, like it said, now you have only one argument, like or two arguments that are the same. I think that is why it can be treated like something with like valency changing. And also, while I was preparing this talk, I thought maybe we can even analyze reciprocals and reflexive in the same way, because actually it's just saying that like, I mean, like reflexive is like reciprocal, but only with the one person. So I don't know if I'm clear. Like in reciprocal, it just said that person who is a subject also is an object or something like that. Agens is also sense. I don't know, but for two or more people, and reflexive is for one people. So I don't know if I'm answering your question right now, but well, yeah. Once again, maybe some more considering argument structure and valency could help.
Yeah, like so. What I guess the basic intuition is that a reciprocal isn't valency reducing. It's basically saying something more specific about the relationship between the arguments than, you know, X did something
Yeah,
to Y and saying Y also did it to X. And so it kind of takes a verb and turns it into this mutual verb. But to do that, it basically has to say, grab me the verbal thing and then produce two versions of it, one with the arguments reversed from the other one.
Yeah.
So it's really valency modifying. It's not valency reducing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
something with valency marking. I think it would work here, but I just don't know how to formalize it properly for now. Maybe I would come up with something. Actually, there are maybe not a lot, but some works in LFG about semantic of reciprocals. But as long as I mostly consider syntax here, I'm not worked. I haven't worked on semantics, but maybe I actually should think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There is a comment by Brian O'Haron in the chat. I'm going to read it out loud. Have you looked for a contrast between they caused each other to visit them versus they caused them to visit each other? And Brian says, my guess is that this is going to be the same form.
I tried to do this, but I just can't come up with a right example that would be like that could be written in every direction. I use something like they cast each other to meet with them, but for my consultants, it was strange that they cast each other to meet with someone, because for them it's like strange situation where you cast me to meet with someone, I cast you to meet with someone, but yeah, they can't somehow say it in a bazaar, because it's hard even in Russian or English, I think. Maybe not that hard, but it's definitely something that I should consider. Maybe when I would be there next time, I would try to come up with better sentences. Yeah, thank you. In my intuition, it should be the same. I'm just wondering, is there any, for example, if absolutive argument and ergative argument both can bind indirect object reciproc, like who would be the first to bind it? Something like that. I'm interested in this. Is there any preferences or something? But it's just hard to get an example. But thank you very much once again.
Yeah, and let's thank Timothy once again for his talk. And so the final talk for this workshop will be delivered by Наталья Сердобольская and Anna Osipova. And the title of the talk is Genitive Possessors in Bessermian und Muth, if I remember it correctly. На рабочем столе.
Yeah, here's the title of the talk once again. Okay. So we present the data of Bessermian und Muth, the data about genitive modifiers in this variety of Udmurt language. So I have to say that this is our preliminary analysis. It is very sketchy, and it is done with an LRFG approach, but we will not consider here any vocabulary items or semantic stuff. We will concentrate only on C structure and P structure rules. However, I'm open to your criticism, but I hope that we will raise some interesting issues. And here are some puzzles which we will discuss. The first one which is the status of extraposed genitives and how can we model the possessive agreement with them. And the second puzzle is which grammatical function should be used for so-called argument genitive modifiers of so-called picture nouns, and how can the double genitive construction be formalized. So here is the basic information about genitives in Besserman. There are two types of genitive modifiers, and the first one is the possessive genitive modifiers. So the possessor in this language bears the genitive case marker, and the possessum is always marked with the possessive suffix. There is a bunch of examples here because the possessive suffix agrees with the possessor in person and number, and you can see this contrast with the help of the examples 1 and 2. And the possessive suffix also does agree with the possessum in number, and you can see this from the examples 1 and 3. And according to our elicitation data, the possessive suffixes cannot be omitted in possessive constructions. And there is another issue that the pronominal case marked possessor may be omitted, as in example 4. In this case, only the possessive suffix encodes the possessor. So also exists the second type of genitive modifiers. They are employed by so-called picture nouns. I have to say that this notion is rather used like a label, because not all nouns that have genitive modifiers actually belong to the picture stuff. The possible thematic roles of such arguments are theme, like photo of Moscow, author, like the book of Martin Haspelmat, and the constitutive component, like the collection of butterflies, as an example 5. And in this case, possessive suffixes normally do not show number agreement, in contrast with the ordinary possessive suffixes in ordinary possessive constructions, and they retain only agreement in person. Also, the possessive suffix on picture noun can be freely omitted, which also contrasts with the data of possessive constructions. And it seems to us that possessive suffixes in the head noun, when they occur in the absence of genitive modifier, always are interpreted as referring to regular possessors, but not to the arguments themselves. Thus, the form collects ИЯз will be rather interpreted as his collection, but not as a collection of these things. So the first topic will be about the position of possessive genitive modifiers, the first type of genitive modifiers in Udmurt. And we observe the variety of the positions. First of all, genitive possessor commonly occur in the preposition to the possessum, and they are the leftmost dependents usually, but also do permit other noun phrase modifiers to precede them, as in example 6. However, there are also two another options. Genitive possessors can be separated from the possessum, as in 7, and maybe post-post to the possessum, as in 8. Also, we have the examples where genitive possessors are associated with pronouns and question words. So basically, here we can see that genitive arguments, genitive modifiers occur in separate projection with no doubt, but do genitive modifiers in BCRMAN always occur in separate projection or not? Here we present some arguments that genitive possessors do in fact form a single constituent with their possessums. First of all, nouns with two distinct possessors can be coordinated, as in 10, your son and my daughter are friends. And second, we have the clitic, which attaches to the first constituent of the clause, and this clitic can also appear after the possessor plus noun sequence, as in 11. So we conclude that proposed possessive genitive modifiers are noun phrase internal by default. But what about this construction with extraposed possessors? So we observe that the possessor separated from the noun in the oblique syntactic position is ungrammatical. It is shown in 12. So here we can see, here we have the noun which is in the dative case, which means the recipient, and the possessor associated with it when separated is ungrammatical. Moreover, I can add that two extraposed possessors inside one clause are ungrammatical. You can see that in 13, even if these, even if they don't belong to the noun, which belong to the nouns which are in oblique syntactic position, even if this requirement is satisfied, there are two extraposed possessors still are not grammatical. Sorry. What about post-post genitives? They actually behave the same way as the prepost ones, so nouns with post-post and prepost possessors can be coordinated. As you can see from this example, the first possessor here is prepost, and the second one is post-post, and they can freely occur in coordination. Also, prepost and post-post genitive possessors show no difference in respect of possible dependence. Their linear position is similar. So we conclude that prepost and post-post genitives are basically do both occur in noun phrase. And what about constituent structure? So it was shown that possessive noun phrases differ from originally noun phrases in respect of the distribution. So, for example, possessive noun phrases are always marked in the direct object position. So we assume that possessive phrases are DPs, and it is the presence of the possessive suffix that determines the specific distribution of such possessive constructions. So we consider them to belong to the D category. And the phrase structure rules are the following. Actually, they are pretty simple. And I have to add here one note that we employ the shuffle operator for modeling pre- and post-post genitive modifiers, as we assume that they are equivalent. And also here we can see that the noun phrase which belongs to the possessor is in brackets because the possessor can be omitted. And what about external possessors? We assume that they are clause-level adjuncts, and we recall that external possessors may only modify subjects or objects. Thus, we adopt such a grammatical function, obl-pos. It merely states that this is the possessor which belongs to the structure of subject or to the structure of object. And why we do so? This seems reasonable because two external possessors are always unaccepted inside the one clause. So their co-occurrence will be thus bent by the uniqueness condition. And also in accordance with our proposal, there are two structural positions possible for possessors, and they both can be filled if the uniqueness condition is not violated. So here, the example 17, we can see that actually these two positions are filled, and this example is grammatical because these possessive modifiers belong to the distinct nouns. What about another approaches to external possessors? For example, one of them proposes that external possessors are the edge function, and they may be linked to possessive suffixes via anaphora or lexical sharing. So we will show now that the first option is incompatible with the Besserian and Moore data. And as for the lexical sharing approach, it is yet unclear to what extent it can be compatible with the LRFG framework. I'm open to your comments there as well. So here you can see that possessive suffixes lack anaphoric properties when genitive modifiers are present, so they cannot occur inside the other clause. So they have to occur inside the same clause where the possessive modifiers occurs, and they may have no split antecedents. So possessive suffixes are actually agreement suffixes in our analysis, and we use following templates for them. They are also rather straightforward. And the first rule here accounts for the pronoun interpretation of the possessive modifier when the noun has no association with any genitive possessor. So it's actually simple, but there is a tricky issue that the nouns associated with extraposed genitives do retain their possessive agreement, and it is not guaranteed by our C-structure rules. So how can we solve this issue? For that, we employ Excelia style check feature, which was originally used for LFG analysis. But maybe it is now even more reasonable because we have our morphological structure inside the syntactic tree, and we actually can just refer to this morphology via this feature. So this feature ensures the presence of possessive morphology, and it is incorporated into the phrase structure rule for nouns, which are marked with possessive suffixes, and extraposed genitives are thus linked with these nouns occurring with possessive suffixes via analogous constraint, and they cannot occur in the absence of possessive agreement. And the second issue about picture nouns and constructions with two genitive modifiers. So what about their syntax? These modifiers, these argument genitives, posit no restrictions on modification, as you can see from 20, and such genitive modifiers also do not sit in the restricted syntactic position. They may be separated from the head noun by other noun phrase dependence. So we assume that genitive arguments seem roughly equivalent to possessive genitive modifiers, as they don't have reduced syntax, they are not bare stems, and they do not occupy the lowest noun phrase position, they are not complements. Okay, but presumably possessive genitive modifiers occupy higher structural position in respect of argument genitives, as in all our data they occur in the leftmost position. You can see that also in 22. The first genitive is possessive and the second genitive is argument. And crucially, when two genitives co-occur, only one possessive suffix is realized on the head noun. And there are two systems in Besserian. In the first system, the possessive suffix may either agree with the possessive genitive or with the argument genitive. And in the second system, only the possessive suffix of the higher possessive genitives may be realized. So how can we model it? First of all, I will gonna talk about grammatical functions of such argument modifiers. There are two main basic approaches. The first one proposes the function encomp for English of obliques. So this function is unrestricted, but the problem with it, I guess, is the following. This function seems to additionally reflect the syntactic position of noun arguments, as in this analysis they are treated as complements indeed. But in Basirman, we have no evidence that the same holds. And another approach is to use the function oblique. It's actually L, oblique team. So this is, in contrast, the restricted function, and it also raises a problem that Basirman genitive arguments do not seem to belong to the same semantic class. So that's why we will use encomp function, but in our case, it won't reflect the syntactic position of genitives. However, it may be assumed that such genitives are semantic complements, but we will not implement it, and maybe this is somehow a wild guess, I don't know. And what about constituent structure? So we propose that possessive genitives occur higher in the structure than argument genitives, though the last ones also may trigger possessive agreement. So we propose that noun phrases with argument genitives are post-piece, and we assume such phrase structure rules to account for the fact that only one possessive suffix may be realized on the head. I will comment on the second rule. Here you can see that we have two possibilities. We can have the possessive suffix in the structure with argument genitives, and we can have no possessive suffix. And in this case, we are provided also with these check features, which will transfer this information to other parts of the structure. We have come to the conclusion here with all these rules that possessive suffixes may either have the category D or the category pos. Maybe it is rather dispreferred, but maybe it is also may capture some facts, because possessive suffixes that have the category D are able to have pronominal interpretation, whereas that ones that are instances of category pos, they may be freely omitted and presumably have no pronominal properties. And the additional rule for D bar now looks the following way. We account here for the fact that the possessive suffix from this possessive construction may be omitted in situation when we have this argument genitive in our structure, and when the head noun also has the possessive suffix already, which agrees with the argument genitive. So only in this case, this rule will provide us with the possibility to omit this possessive suffix. Okay, so here is the illustration of all that stuff. The first tree illustrates the situation when we have the agreement with the possessive genitive modifier. So here the head D is present, and here this possessive modifier occurs, whereas the head pos is absent from the structure. So the possessive modifiers which must agree with the argument genitives is simply absent. So we have only one possessive suffix. And in the second case, when we have agreement with the argument genitive, in contrary, it is the D head which is absent, and we retain only the pos head, which includes this suffix which agrees with the argument genitive. Okay, so it was all which I wanted to tell. Thanks for your attention.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, do I didn't understand you correctly that you have the possessive suffix, the same suffix can appear either in D or in pos, right? And maybe, I mean, I think it's not very elegant. Maybe there's another way to, I mean, like pos is just a functional element which agrees with the possessor, while D is something which carries the possession features. But maybe you can do it, I mean, maybe you can do it through, for example, constraints on the pred features of the possessor, not with this check p-morph features, the XLE style. Maybe it will be more elegant this way, and you could kind of say that if there is no pred, like the pred is optional, but it is introduced if there is no, it's not defined elsewhere, like check whether it exists, something like this. But I mean, this has to be worked out, but I just think that maybe it's possible. I mean, why do you think it's impossible to say it's just one position?
Yeah, I think that it will do more. It will be more elegant. But yeah, I think that it is reasonable that you have just said. I think that yeah, it actually will be better. So I'll try to reformulate this.
Are there any questions here in live audiences? Then probably Ash, you can.
Oh, sorry.
Your micro is off. Yeah, now we can hear
I
you.
got it. So thanks for a very nice talk. I have a small comment and then possibly a small question. The comment is, I wonder if the term you're looking for is not so much picture NP. So picture NP is like this concept from binding theory because they show slightly weird binding properties for reflexives and things like that. But it seems to me like the more general concept of a relational noun might be what you're looking for. And I don't know which Vichner you were citing, but the elder Vichner, Carl, has interesting work from the late 90s on this, as do Parti and Borshev. So, you know, relational nouns are different from regular nouns in that they kind of have an intrinsic argument. Kinship terms are typical examples, but so is collection, right? A collection has to be a collection of something. There's no such thing as a collection, period, right? And so that's just my comment. My small question is, was there any particular reason why you ended up going with the NComp analysis rather than Sulger's Abel theme analysis? Because, I mean, the syntactic function of these things is somewhat obscure, but Abel theme at least has the virtue of being a regular kind of grammatical function that appears elsewhere in the theory.
Yeah, I understand you. Yeah, just because that I'm not sure that we can call all these arguments themes only because of this reason.
Okay. Well, I mean, the subscript isn't the important part. The point is it seems to be an oblique. It has to be introduced by some extra stuff. It's not a direct object or something like that.
Yeah, maybe just we can use just oblique data.
Yeah.
Just, okay. Thanks a lot.
Any more questions?
Maybe I'll answer. Maybe I can answer the first part of Ash's question about relational nouns. I think the relational noun is too broad a term because it also encompasses nouns like kin terms and all kinds of body parts and so on. But here the focus is what we wanted to focus on were two valent nouns like picture, which has a possessor and an author, the represented object, right? So the same about book, like book who has an author and a possessor, and we tried to find some term for this. Thank you.
Yeah, so you can.
I just have a quick follow-up. I mean, I guess I take relational noun to be sort of definitionally something that has two arguments, or like has an extra argument, as well as the thing that you're predicating the noun on. So, but the book case you raised is interesting because, so you know your example about the Udmurt poet? Can you go back there?
Go back to
Oh, there it was.
Mhm.
So book is interesting because it has both a sort of relational, I mean, in some languages at least, it has both a relational guise and kind of a non-relational guise. So if I say the book of poems, it seems to be a relational noun. But if I say the book about France is just a modifier, and the whatever the book is of is just left implicit. So do you get, I don't know if you have this in your data, but you know, like if it was something like this book about the Udmurt poet got torn, would that have to have necessarily sort of a different structure?
I think it would have some other kind of postposition in it. So
Yeah, so it wouldn't be in the genitive.
it wouldn't be genitive, yeah. But you can
Right.
add the possessor here, my book of this Udmurt poet. So and in that case, it would have two valences.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot for this discussion. It actually was really helpful.
Yeah, and doesn't seem like we have any more questions, and probably it's time for us to wrap up. We are almost on our finishing right on time with our extended schedule. So I would like once again to thank everyone who joined in today. We had a quite large Zoom audience also today, for which we are grateful. Also, big thanks to Ash again for being our first speaker today. Also, please note that it's still 10 a.m. In America, and so Ash started talking at 7 a.m. in the morning. Yeah,
Hardcore.
So, yeah. So thank you very much for attending.
Thanks for a great workshop. Bye, everybody.